All right, welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about token-based authentication within Django REST frameworks. Our lesson today is going to cover different types of authentication, basic, session, and token-based authentications. We have the abstract user model, which we'll be utilizing today within Django. We're going to talk about why creating a user model can raise migration problems. We'll then talk about handling those migration issues. We'll dive into Django REST Frameworks authentication, where we're going to actually bring in that token authentication app. We're going to add the authentication class to our scripts. We'll then talk about what the token model looks like. And we're going to talk about the token authentication workflow. Now that we have our token created inside of our project and we have our user created inside of our project, we'll dive into our views. We'll create the actions for the user to be able to sign up for a new account, log in, and then we'll cover what authentication classes look like to be able to confirm the user when a user sends a request, where we'll log out, not lot out. I'll need to make sure that that gets changed, where we'll be able to log out a user or grab a user's info. All right. At this point, does anyone have any questions over what we'll be covering today? Right. Doesn't look like we have any questions. So let me go ahead and send this message out here on the chat. Perfect. That message is inside of the Avenger channel. And it should take everybody over to the authentication classes here. So here in the authentication classes, it goes into grabbing how every single time a request is made, a request user property will typically be set to an instance inside of the contribute auth pertaining to the user class. All right, so now there's a whole process of how authentication is determined. This portion here is pretty important. All right, we have a REST framework, the default authentication classes that are allowed. We can allow for basic authentication, session authentication, and so on. And we're going to actually come back to this documentation here shortly. But I want everyone to know this is where we're going to grab all of our authentication methods for REST frameworks. Now here, there's a couple of different authentication classes that are being presented. We have basic authentication and we have session authentication. Well, let's talk about a couple of examples of this. If I come up above here and I start thinking, well, what could be basic authentication? Basic authentication is in reference to where any request that requires authentication will include the user credentials within the headers of the request and or within the URL parameters. An example of this. Earlier, when we were working with Python, we went ahead and imported requests, and we were able to do something like, hey, response is equal to request.get at API slash version one slash napi.com. Let's go ahead and do this. HTTP as this is just an example, right? Not necessarily something that actually exists. But in basic based authentication, we might have something like, hey, I need to include headers, where my headers would include something like X dash authentication or X dash. I think there's another one that I've seen is authorization. There's bearer. But inside of these, you would include either an API key or something like that. So that's one way of seeing this basic authentication. Another way that it happens is the authentication would actually be included within the params, where we'll get something like user name, right? So we'll say, hey, after this, we have a question mark pertaining to parameters, which is username, maybe like Favela08, and password, maybe something like 1234. And that would get sent over within the request. Now, basic authentication works. It doesn't necessarily have some sort of issue within it when it comes to functionality, but it does have its limitations. Couple of limitations to take into consideration here. How does a user persist? I'm actually going to write it. Yeah, how does a user persist to exist within different requests? All right, in this case, it wouldn't. The next one is, well, security. In this example, user credentials are exposed every single time a request is sent. So this isn't a very secure way of handling user parameters, right? At the very minimum, I strongly recommend that if you're going to do something like this, you include it within the headers rather than the URL parameters. All right. But this is an example of basic authentication. It's just where the straight username and password are being exposed and they're being sent every single time within the request. Now, a session-based authentication. Now, this is feasible when the front end is being served through server-side rendering. Now, the reason behind that is because when we go ahead and actually run our server, a session is created and managed by the server itself. If I'm using something like server-side rendering within Django, well, every time somebody opens index HTML, a separate session is created for each different client that enters the project. Now, within this session, what we can do is we can log in a user or sign up a user. So a user action can happen where the username and password can be sent within the body of a request. And then the server manages the authentication by checking the session ID. So pretty much as long as the session ID exists, so will the user. And so that's our session-based authentication. Again, this needs to happen through server-side rendering. It is possible with Django. We're not teaching server-side rendering as of now. What we're trying to teach everybody is how to handle a single-page application and have everything in separate files and within separate servers. We're doing this intentionally so that we have to handle cores because course is going to be a fundamental skill that you all need to ensure you master before you go into the workplace. So this is being done intentional while we're not utilizing server-side rendering. All right. And then tokens. Well, tokens is the first thing that I want to highlight is that it is the industry standard. I can spell industry. There you go. For handling authentication. And preferably, majority of companies nowadays utilize something called a JWT token. Now, we're not going to cover what a JWT token is today. We are going to do an introduction into tokens instead. But I strongly recommend that as you're building your personal project, you take a look at JWT tokens and you take it a step further into implementing a JWT authentication base rather than just utilizing the REST framework authentication. All right. Now, a token based means that a user only has to send their credentials in one time. And in exchange, they receive a serialized representation of their token. So even when we return a response, what we're going to return to them is not going to be their actual token. What we're going to return to them is going to be something called a token key, which will be a serialized representation of their actual token. And then the server will check for the token upon request and authenticate the user prior to executing API view logic. All right, so those are three different types of authentication. If I were to write this out in an example for session-based authentication, in here, it would look something like this, where again, we would import request. I would log in a user. And say HTTP API slash user slash login. And then I would pass in a body within the request that would say username, Traveler08, and then password, which again, we'll just put 1234 in there. All right, well, when this is received in the back, the user will likely be a representation of the actual user itself. But within my API view, I'm just going to call this user info, which is going to inherit from API view. There would be something called a session. So def request. And I can say user is equal to request dot session dot user. And that would actually return the user that's currently logged in to the session. And I see a hand go up. Go ahead, Andy.
That class user info would that typically be in the views file?
It would, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, so this would be client sending the request, and this is server sending a response. Now, on the other side, when we're talking about handling it with a token, what would look pretty much the same here, where we would actually, I'm just going to copy and paste this actually. This would actually bring back a token. The client, the request is being sent, the server is there. And then once we actually have a token, whenever we want to get information, well, we can do request, or let's say user info is equal to request dot get that goes to HTTP API slash user slash info. Then it would close it and would say headers. And in here in the headers, we would specify that authorization is of bearer token. Right? So then we would be able to send back that token. And in the server side, what would happen is we would just do request.user. Because inside of the request, we'll talk about this within the API flow. Inside of the request, once that token gets authenticated to a user, there will be a user parameter that will be changed from none to the matching user for that token. All right. So now we've seen a couple of code examples here as to the difference between session-based authentication, what token-based authentication would look like, and what base authentication would look like. The main thing to point out is that token authentication is now the industry standard. It is very uncommon to utilize server-side rendering nowadays. Typically, your front-end application will be served with a completely different server, or excuse me, it's very rare for your backend and your front end to be living within the same server. So typically they're going to be living on separate servers apart from one another. They may be still utilizing the same URL pattern to be able to enter the um, excuse me, the AWS cloud framework where they're actually existing, or whatever hosting file it is they're existing. They might still have the same exact URL pattern, but there's a routing logic that happens inside of them so that anything that doesn't ping API goes to the front end server, and everything that pings API slash version whatever pings the backend server. So that's the main difference there. And that's why token authentication is the industry standard. All right. I just did a lot of talking and a lot of writing in here. So let me go ahead and take a pause and open it up for questions. Does anyone have any questions over different types of authentication, why they exist, and not necessarily how to implement them, because this is a very rough example, but you can go ahead and ask questions about their implementation as well.
I think I would have more questions if you start implementing them.
All right, great. In that case, then let's dive right in. Let's start implementing these models or these concepts. The first thing we're going to talk about is going to be the user. So we're going to take a step back from the whole types of authentication, and we're going to talk about the different types of users that are available within Django. To do that, I'm going to go ahead and change directory into my Pokédex project. Within my Pokédex project, I'm going to run Python, manage py, start app, and I'll go ahead and call this the trainer app. All right, let's stay with the theme of Pokemon. So our users are going to be known as trainers. All right, so now within my trainer app, I'm going to simply dive into my models. And I do have this Django.db.models. And for the majority of our class, this has worked perfectly well whenever we're creating a model. But in this case, I'm not just creating a regular database model. I'm actually going to create my own user model. So it's not just going to come in from Django.db. In this case, I'm going to go into from Django.contrib.auth.models. And I'm going to import the abstract user. Now, if I wanted to find out where I would be able to find this, I can ask Google as well. I can say within Django, where do I import the abstract user model class? All right, so here I can see it gives me an example, import the abstract user model. There's a couple of Stack Overflows, but we all love documentation. So let's go ahead and take a look at some documentation from Django. So here we go. So customizing authentication in Django. So here it tells me, hey, there's the contrib authenticate. So it's talking about a couple of methods. This is going to be super useful whenever we're diving into different types of authentication. And for all of you, when you're working within your Django projects, in your personal projects, and trying to figure out what other types of authentication you could implement or how authentication works in the back end, you can do so by just simply reading this documentation here. All right. Well, now I have the abstract user. But what is the abstract user? I can try to find it within the documentation. I personally like to do this whole looking at the class itself. So here we can see the abstract user is inheriting from a permissions mixin. We're not going to talk about permissions today, but in this case, it's essentially going to have all of the permissions that are already created within Django. There's no permission limitations other than, is this a super user? Is it not a super user? And I can define it here. All right. Now we can see that there's a couple of class name attributes. So there's a username validator that takes in the username. If I want to take a look at the username validator, it shows it here. You can see that it follows some sort of regex. May contain only letters, numbers, and specific special characters. All right. As I dive in, you can see that my username only has 150. A lot of the hard portions or the thinking as to what fields should exist within my model are already being provided for me within the abstract user. Right, we can see the last name, email is staff, is active. There's a date joined here. There's a user manager objects that gets implemented. And down here, we have a couple of key components. So the email field refers to the email. The username field refers to the username. And the required fields has the email being included. A couple of methods that are also being implemented for us. You can see that there's a get full name method that already grabs the first and last name for us. So this is great. If I really wanted to customize this a little bit, let's say that in our case, rather than having an entire username field, I just want my email field to be my username. Well, I can come over to models. I can say class trainer. And here I can inherit from the abstract user. Well, from there I can say email is equal to models dot email field. I can say that this needs to be unique equals true. And then I can pass in, well, the username field. Instead of it being username, I want it to be email. And in the required fields, well, you'll notice that the required fields already has email inside of it. So the required fields is a list of, without this, I can't exist. But username field needs to be excluded from the list. So I can just simply say that the list is empty now. Before it had email inside of it. This is the inherited um, attribute that I have, but I'm utilizing polymorphism to change it to an empty list, right? My username field is email, so I'm removing email from that required fields list. I could change a couple of other things or even add some attributes. I can put something like likes Pokemon and make this a models.boolean field that I can default to true because who doesn't like Pokemon? And all of these other attributes that are being represented here, they're going to be created for me automatically. So I don't need to necessarily change anything else. In your email field, you may want to look into some sort of email validation tool. Something that I've liked to utilize. Uh, Let me go ahead and grab this real quick. Here you are. And let me open it up. Give me a second, Nick. I apologize. Something that I like to utilize is this email validator. Really useful, specifically because a common issue that we see is that so by default, the email validator is just looking for a specific regex capability, right? Where it has an @ sign, X, Y, and Z.com. That's all it's looking for. And although that does do a little bit of validation for us, it doesn't necessarily actually implement if the email is working and exists. And this validate email function does. This check deliverability, if you change it to true, it's going to actually check if the email exists and if you could actually prompt the email by sending it some sort of, it's not going to actually send an email to it, but it is going to look within the DNS to make sure that it's an email that exists and can receive messages. Um, a couple of things to go in here. I'm not going to cover this tool, but just so everyone is tracking, this does exist. It will do your email validation for you, and I strongly recommend you use it so that you're not going through your application or presenting a personal project with just fake emails. It's something to give your personal project a little bit of a boost. All right, I see a hand up. Go ahead, Nick.
Would you go back to your custom trainer class real quick? Model, I should say. So now there are, as of right now, are there any required fields in your class?
So as of right now, the only required fields in my class, and I should say this to be assumed, would be a username, password, and email. Now, this is a little bit confusing because I'm saying my username is my email field, right? Well, when we type in our request or when we go to create an object, an example of this would look like this, where we would pass in a trainer where username is equal to data.email, where password is equal to data.password, and email is equal to data.email. It still expects there to be a username parameter to get passed in. It just has to be set to the email itself.
Okay, so line 10 doesn't get rid of the requirements that some things need to be included.
Right. This is for the additional fields, such as, so if I go back here, let's say I wanted first name and last name. Like no matter what, somebody has to tell me their first name and last name.
You'd have to put them inside that list.
I would just have to add it inside this
Okay.
list. Let's say first name, comma, last name. It would just have to be represented as a string. And we'll leave it like that, actually, just to make sure that we're getting it. All right. Any other questions?
And so the first name and the last name would just be passed in trainer, same way as using the password and all that is, right?
Yes. So we would just now have a first name, which is equal to data dot first name, and then last name, which again would be equal to data dot last name. Right. Or to make it even better, it would just be something like trainer data. All right, Michael.
If you go to if you go to the other models page that you have, yeah, that one. If you scroll down to, or let's see where you, there's a thing called is active. I think it might be further up. Oh, you're right there. Would that affect, because you said using the authentication for the email, the DNS check, would is active like deleting an account through is active, would that affect that check? Like if that email already exists?
It would not. So it would still keep track of the email being a unique value. So if as a new user come in, they were still going to check that. This is active portion. Let's see. How can I take a look at it? So let's say you leave Instagram, right? Instagram wouldn't actually delete all of your data. They keep your data for a certain amount of time. I can't remember how long. But let's say you delete your account with Instagram and you leave, and then you decide, oh, you know what? I want to go back and re-download the app and start scrolling again. Well, when you go back, you'll type in your email and it's going to prompt you with something along the lines of, "Hey, we recognize this email. You've had an account before. Was this your old account?" And then it'll show a link to like the old account, and then you could just say, "Yes, this was my account." And all they would do is they would change this flag from being is active to false, being back to true, so that they have their
Okay.
active users available.
Because you mentioned like for the presentation, if we leave that like email check on, it makes it like a little bit more realistic, but I want to make sure that because I remember seeing the videos people would make an account and they had like 500 emails from just like making a bunch of accounts to check the login works. Would that like run into an issue if we only have like one email we want to actually use and test the DNS feature? If we had like a delete button connected to is active, could we go and make a new account to check that it works?
Got it. Okay. So if you're doing something like that, you would have to change the tool here to something called testing. You could put it inside of a testing parameter. And you could also check the deliverability back to false just to make sure that it doesn't. Here it is. So the testing environment, you could put this to true so that it
Gotcha.
doesn't necessarily cause any issues when you're creating new emails or you're having something to be able to yeah, just create multiple emails that you could just randomly ensure that your login functionality works. I also just recommend doing that through test cases rather than doing it by manually placing over and over again different requests.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks.
Of course. All right. Awesome. So now we got our ability to, okay, so we've created our trainer model. I apologize. I got a little bit lost in my train of thought there. We've seen what the abstract user looks like. We understand where the abstract user is coming from. It is an authentication model. It's not just a regular database model. Well, now that I created a trainer, which is going to be my user, I need to actually tell my project, hey, this trainer is going to be what we're going to be using as our user moving forward. So we're going to plug this into the settings.py, and then we're going to see that it's going to raise a couple of migration issues. So before I run this, I'm going to Python manage py, dump data from the move app, move dash dash indent to, I want to drop this into the move app dot fixtures dot move fixtures. All right. And then I'm going to run the same command, but for my Pokemon. All right, so now all of my data has been backed up. I know I'm going to be running into some migration issues. So let's go ahead and dive into this. Well, how's this going to look? All right. I'm going to come over to my Pokédex projects in settings.py, come over to installed apps, and in here, I'll bring in my trainer app. Now let's see what happens when I run make migrations. Well, I get all kinds of errors. It's gonna tell me, hey, you're trying to create a new user, but as of right now, we already have a user. So it's telling me that I have some user permissions errors, et cetera, et cetera. All right, well, then the question rises, maybe it's because I haven't dictated that this is going to be the user that we'll be utilizing. Well, I do that by saying auth, and I wish I could remember this one off the top of my head. There you go. So this one's going to be auth user model. And we're going to set this to the trainer app.trainer. Now let's try to make migrations again. Well, now the migrations happen. I'm able to make migrations because I specified here in settings.py how to route to the proper user model. I am telling it to no longer use the default user within Django. So now a migration was applied. Well, let's see if this can migrate. Well, now when I try to migrate, I'm getting an error. And let's pay attention to what this error is telling me. So in Django.db.migrations exception, inconsistent migration history. Migration admin 001 initial is applied before its dependency trainer 001 on database default. All right, so what this is saying is there has been a migration inside of the admin portal 001 that is trying to access the user that I'm routing to. In this case, the user that I'm routing to is the trainer or the auth user model. But the trainer didn't exist this whole time. There was no such thing as a trainer. Well, let's see. Do I have access to admin? I do not. So since I don't have access to admin, what can I do to fix this? Now, let's take a look at other migration files. This one is initial. We can see that it has auth models in there, some auth validators. Oh, this one is from the trainer app, so that makes sense. Let's go into a different one like Pokemon app and take a look at the initial migration. So this just has migrations and models. So these migration histories aren't going to necessarily cause an issue with my new user model. And I can expect the same thing for my app, or excuse me, my Move app. Right? This is an initial, there's no dependency on the user. Now, unfortunately, I don't have access to the admin portal. Now, typically, when you go to create a project, you should create your user model first to ensure that you avoid migration dependency issues within the admin module. All right, so I'm just going to leave that there as a friendly reminder. Well, how do I fix this? Well, the best way to fix this is to actually restart all of our migrations. So currently, there's something already inside of my database. If I go ahead and drop DB, which is going to be Pokédex DB, and create DB, back to Pokédex DB, I can open up the database inside of a separate file here. So PSQL, Pokédex DB, and I can just do a /D to see if there's any relationships. So currently this database is completely empty. There's no tables inside of it. Well, now let's make our migrations. Let's say Python, manage py, make migrations. There's going to be nothing to change there. Python, manage py, migrate. And now when I run this migrate, you can see that a bunch of them, or everything, you can see that everything was successful. This applying admin 001 initial okay. When the database is empty, this python.managepy.migrate command will actually create the migration for the admin portal. And that's the reason why we had to drop the database and recreate it. Now it's just as simple as bringing my data back. Python manage py, load data, and we can do this from move app /fixtures/ move JSON. Okay, something that I did wrong there. Problem installing fixture. I used the wrong command, didn't I?
This is supposed to be down instead of / for this one.
Is that what it is? It's supposed to be a dot path. Like this?
Yeah, I think that's what it was.
I don't think so.
Without the .json.
You got one more
What am
slash
I
in there if
thinking
that's
about?
the case.
I don't think that's the case. Let me go ahead and look it up instead to make sure that's right. Load data command Django. Django admin match py. Okay, got it. Nope, it's right. Interesting. Okay, let me take a look at the error here. So problem installing fixtures. Okay, well, what was the problem? Help me out here. Let me take a look up above. Let me see if my Pokemon will work here. Well, it wouldn't unless my move app actually works. Let's see what my fixtures. That's what's happening there. An API key was dropped. Okay. That API key is being dropped because I have some sort of print statement existing within here. So let me go ahead and get rid of that. Okay, that API key is now gone. Print statement's good. That's more than likely something that happened inside of my Pokemon app fixtures as well. Did not know that behavior was a thing. All right, manage py, load data. And this one's going to be the Pokemon app fixtures Pokemon data.json. And there you go. All of my data for my Pokemon is back up to date. I did, however, change a couple of things inside of my database. So I want to make sure that that is reflected within my answers document down below. So I'm going to go to answers. Here's a Pokemon, all moves, all Pokemon. That needs to get changed. That should be true. Let's see here. Okay, then the rest are false. Okay, so now the file is working correctly. I'm really hoping that I didn't change anything else in my dependencies by deleting that Pikachu. let's make sure this works. So let's run Python manage py test dot test views. Okay, so I am getting a failure here. That's happening because I changed my JSON data. So test 01 of get all Pokemon. That's what I expected there to be an issue with. I'm not going to go into fixing this test right now because it's going to take us outside of the scope of the lesson. But know that it happened because I changed my JSON data or my fixtures when I dumped all of my data. All right. Now, bringing everything back into scope, we got our settings. Everything has been changed. The trainer app has been connected. And now in between SQL, if I run \d, I have my entire tables moved in to include the trainer. All right, so all of the trainer permissions and everything in there has been created. Great. To do a quick summary over how we handled the trainer, in models, we imported the abstract user. We inherit the abstract user within trainer. In our case, we want to make sure that the email field is being utilized as the username. So we have to ensure it is unique. We're adding a new attribute called likes Pokemon, which will be true or false. We changed the username field to be of email, meaning that we have to remove it from the required fields. And instead, we added the required fields to include first and last name. When we attempted to make migrations, we had an issue because there was a sort of, we need to specify, hey, what is going to be my user model? And we did that here. I apologize for the scrolling, everybody. On line 143, we defined that the auth user model will be of trainer app.trainer. But then when we attempted to migrate into our database, we ran into a database issue where admin was trying to run an initial migration when it already had a previous initial migration to an old user. So its dependency list was causing an issue. We had to drop the database, recreate it. We then made our migrations and migrated, and then loaded our data back onto our database so that everything is back to its current state. Does anyone have any questions over how we implemented the user model? Okay, doesn't look like we have any questions over how we implemented the user model. With that said, before we start diving into Django REST Framework's token authentication token, let's go ahead and take a good 20-minute break. Currently, it is 9:51. Let's come back at 10:10 to continue on with our lecture. Thank you so much, everyone, and I'll see everyone back here shortly. Yeah. Okay, welcome back, everyone. And now we're going to start diving into token-based authentication. So a couple of important things to think about here is, well, there's already an authentication schema that we can grab. So we can grab this over and bring it over to our API views, which we currently don't have any. So let's go ahead and actually, oh, this actually goes inside of settings. I'm just going to put it at the very bottom. Here you go. So REST framework. Now we know we're not going to be utilizing basic authentication or session-based authentication, but we'll leave it there for now, just so that we have this dictionary available to us. As we continue working down, it looks like it shows us a couple of examples as to how to apply these classes. It tells us that in REST framework, there's an authentication and a permissions portion that we can grab. It goes into the @API view decorator. There's a built-in unauthorized or forbidden response that's going to check for permissions. There's a login required middleware, which we really don't need for this portion. That's really cool. Actually, I think this is newish. because I haven't seen that before. So something to look into there if you're looking to deploying an Apache server. All right. And now we see some API references. Well, in APIs, we can either have token authentication, or excuse me, basic authentication, or we can have token-based authentication. Now, it walks me through the process. It says, hey, if you want to utilize this API, we have or this token-based authentication, which we already have built in, you can, but there's a couple of things that you have to do. Although you'll have imported REST frameworks into your installed apps, auth token didn't automatically come in. So if you want to utilize the app of auth token, you need to manually add it into your installed apps. We see that here. So let's take care of that portion. I'm going to come over to my installed apps here. I see REST framework, and I'm going to go ahead and add REST framework dot auth token. Make sure that's the correct convention. It is great. So that's going to be auth token. And it tells me, well, hey, make sure to run managepy.migrate because the REST framework app token provides a database migration for a token. Interesting. Well, let me go ahead and take a look here. Let's actually apply that portion. Let's say Python manage py, make migrations. There's no migrations to be made. Manage py migrate. And notice that when I run migrate, there's 4 additional migrations that were created. And this is for the auth token. Nice. Well, now it goes into telling me that I could import the token class. And although I could import the token class, this is I would like to see what actually is the token class and what attributes are in there. So before I start applying the rest of this, I'm going to go ahead and take a look into that model. Let me see if there's any additional nodes that I have to ensure are taken care of here. Let's see. Here we have our generating tokens view. Let me scroll up a little bit here. Okay, so Django REST framework, token authentication. Scheme, you'll need to configure the authentication classes. Interesting. What does that look like? Okay, so it looks like the default authentication classes are basic authentication and session-based authentication. But it's not actually telling me what other authentication classes are available for me. Okay, let's actually go back and see what happens if we continue reading the documentation to include token authentication. Okay, so it quite literally tells me right there what it is that I have to add. So I can come to the very bottom of my file, and I can specify, well, actually, I'll be utilizing REST framework, authentication, token authentication. That will be how I'm going to implement my token authentication. And I'm telling my settings, so my entire project is tracking that this is how it will happen. So I can remove the 2 above because I'm no longer going to be utilizing basic or anything else. I'm only allowing for token authentication. Great. So we configured the authentication classes to token authentication. It's been added. We installed the app. We made our migration. And now we actually have the model that we can look at. Let's implement this model here. Inside of my trainer app, I'm going to create a views, or excuse me, I already have a views.py, so I don't need to create anything. In here, I'm going to actually say from REST framework dot auth token. I want to import token. Oh, excuse me. Auth token dot models. I want to import token. There you go. And I want to take a look at token. See how this works. Well, token has a key and it needs a user to be able to exist. It does have this created at, which creates a time. And this created at basis is good because typical standard for a token is you want to give it some sort of lifetime, right? Where if a user hasn't logged in or hasn't refreshed their token for a certain amount of time, that token then dies. And then they have to refresh their new token to be able to log into your application. So it's pretty good to have this created at portion. Okay, great. Now, what I really care about is this one-to-one field here. We can see that there's a related name called auth token. So I can go over to my models, and I know that I'm going to be passing in the user into this token. So if I come over to my models, I now know that there will be an auth token field that will link to the token model within my user. And I spelled that wrong. It's auth underscore token, right? I know that that's happening through my related name. Well, now I understand a little bit of how it works. I see that a key can be generated. And let's see if there's a method for generating a key. So there is a method for generating a key. And notice how it's hashed, right? So it's a binary ASCII with hexfly, OSU random, and then it's going to decode it. Okay, great. Well, when we go through the authentication process, it's going to pull this key and it's going to match it to a user. We're going to see that here shortly. Well, now we understand how adding a token, how adding the token app worked. We created everything to our settings. We have the token model, and now we can actually dive into the token authentication workflow. So the workflow for token authentication would look as such, where a user would sign up. This would create a token. A user will log in, which may or may not create a token, but will receive a token within the response. So create a token and receive token within the response. A user can see their info or is authenticated by sending their token within the request and become authenticated within the server. And then we have a user can log out, which will delete the token from the user. Right? There's a couple of different ways that you could handle logging out. You could either delete the token from the user, or you could have a function or some sort of method that will remove the token from the client side. So if there's a browser that's sending these requests, the browser would hold on to the token. Let me take a look at an example here. I think GitHub has a pretty good example of this. Let's see. So if I go over to GitHub, I come over to application, here's my cookies. Okay, so I have a session ID. Logged in is yes. Let's see. So here's my user session. And I'm pretty sure that if I delete that. Okay, so I just deleted my user session. I'm also going to delete my GH session, which hopefully I don't just break GitHub all over everywhere. And let me see if I have anything in local storage as well, defining who I am. So currently, the browser is using all of these different areas to be able to hold to my identity. And every time a request is sent, the server grabs those tokens, whether it be by session or by token, and authenticates me. When I deleted that session ID. No longer the browser is carrying who I am. Let's see what happens when I refresh my page. Well, when I refresh my page, I've now been logged out. My browser no longer can send a request over to GitHub to say, hey, this is the current client that I'm representing. My session has been deleted. So now I have to go through the whole sign-in process all over again. Two-factor authentication. Okay, so I'm gonna be, we sent you a sign-in request. Oh, okay. I'll take care of this later on. No need to worry about it here. Okay. And I'll worry about it later. All right. So now there's a clear example of how we can manage that authentication, right? We could either delete it from the browser side or we could just delete it from the server side. But that token needs to be removed from one end or the other in order to actually sign out that user. That's all that's happening there. There's no magical answer when it comes to logging out. You're just simply removing the token from either the client or the server that represents the user. Well, here's our flow. Let's go ahead and start writing some actual code here. This should look a little bit more familiar. I'm going to say from REST frameworks views. I'm going to import API views. From REST framework response. I'm going to import response. From REST framework, I'm going to import status as S so that I have all my different status codes. And then finally, from .models, I want to import the user model, which in this case is the trainer. All right. Now, there's a couple of other imports that we're going to be running here shortly, but I don't want to just throw a bunch of import statements at all without actually showing us what their usefulness are. So I'm not going to bring them in until they actually become useful to us and we have a way to implement them. So let's start over this user workflow. The first thing we want to do is we want to be able to we want to be able to sign up. Well, I could say class sign up. This is going to take in an API view. And what this is going to do is it's going to accept a post method, which will take in self and request. Now, I don't have to worry about authenticating the token or anything like that just yet, because there is no token, right? This is strictly for generating a token. So this API view will be utilized to generate a token and a user for the first time. All right, so the user doesn't exist and there is no token available. Well, now the post request comes in, I can grab the data. So I can say data is equal to request dot data dot copy. And in that data file, I expect there to be a dictionary with key value pairs for email, first name, last name, password, and username. Now, because my username is my email, that might not be enforced. So what I can do is I can say data dot, or I can say data username is equal to data dot get email to ensure that that username field actually exists. All right, so there's all the information that I need, the requirements that I have. I can now go into creating a user. My user is just a trainer. This looks pretty simple. You can say, hey, new trainer is equal to trainer. And we can pass in the data in there so that we can deconstruct it and create an instance of that trainer. Great. As of now, we saw this from pretty much day one where we were interacted with the Django ORM for creating a model. I see a hand up. Go ahead, Daniel.
So in a previous one, when we were creating something, we didn't deconstruct the data. We just set data equal to data. What's the difference here? with deconstructing it versus just setting data equal to data with the class?
Yeah, so when you're utilizing data equals data, you're referencing to a serializer. In this case, we're not utilizing a serializer, we're actually utilizing the model itself, which is just a class in its purest form for Django. So we can still just deconstruct the data and pass in key value pairs to each attribute. Does that answer your question, Dan? Of
It does, thank you.
course. All right, so now we have our new trainer. Our new trainer has been created, and I can actually go ahead and try to tie that trainer into some sort of user. But first, I want to make sure that the data is validated. So I'm going to run into a try and accept block. So what I'm going to try, I'm going to say new trainer dot full clean. That should run all of my validators against that trainer. Now, if this works, then I want to create a user. You may be asking yourself, well, why aren't we utilizing a serializer? Well, that's because if I utilize a serializer, I have to make a specific create method, which kind of defeats the purpose of the serializer in itself. So instead, I'm going to handle it within my view. And I'm going to do this by saying, all right, now that this worked, I'm going to actually solidify my trainer by running trainer dot save user, nope, dot objects dot create user, where I'll go ahead and pass in my data. So here I create an instance of the trainer. Just want to remind everyone, this does not save onto the database. Down below, I ensure validation is ran against parameters. And then I actually want to use this create user function, because this create user function is what actually hashes the password and registers the user. All right, I see a hand up. Go ahead, Andy.
Are you just thinking forward right now with the create user, or did you already create the create user? Do you define it already in your trainer?
The create user method.
Yes.
This is built in to the dot objects portion of a model. So it already exists.
Okay.
All right. And just to clarify, it already exists because it's coming in through inheritance when I do the abstract user model. Inside of the abstract user model, it inherits from another class, and that inherits from another class. Through inheritance, that specific method exists. All right. So now I created my new trainer. My new trainer now exists. Well, what about my token? Well, now I can say my token is, and actually I'm going to say this token object is equal to token dot objects dot create. And the only thing that it needs is a user, where my user is set to the trainer that I have just created. Well, let's take a look at token again. Token has a key and user that I can utilize. So when I return a response, I can return a response where just the key comes back. All right, let's go ahead and say, hey, the new token that has been created is of token object dot key. And because this has been created, I can specify the status is of HTTP 201 created. All right. Any questions as to how we are coming up with this logic? Let's hear it, Andy.
You said that it has not been saved on the database. When will you save it on the database?
Yeah, so in line 21, we don't save it in the database. In line 24, we do save it in the database. So that's when it registers the user.
Okay.
Alex?
Can you explain the full clean again and why you don't need that for the token object?
Absolutely. So before we were making sure that our validators were being ran against a model utilizing serializers. In this case, we're not utilizing a serializer, so I don't have the is valid method, right? I still want to make sure that all of my validators are being ran. So I use the full clean, which will run my validators against my trainer. Now, the reason why I don't need to do that for my token object is because my token is not my model. It's not something that's being passed in, not something that I created. They have their own methods and everything built in the background to ensure that this works properly. So I don't need to actually validate it or anything like that before creating a new data entry. Does that answer your question, Alex?
Yep. Thank you.
Of course. Any other questions? All right. Well, now there's my try block. Let's go ahead and pass in the exception. Well, now we can return a response, and we could just return E, which is going to be my errors. And I can specify that this is a status of HTTP. Let's do 400 bad requests for now. Well, now let's try this out. I'm going to actually open up Postman to be able to send this request moving forward. I hope everyone is using Postman and that they're enjoying their experience with it. Let me go ahead and run my server. Let's make sure this get request works for Pikachu still. Okay, Pikachu still exists. Let me make sure I grab all of my Pokemon and make sure that that works great. Awesome. Well, now I'm talking about sending a request, but I don't have any URLs that connect to this API view. So let's go ahead and fix that. I'm going to go ahead and go into my trainer app and make a urls.py. I'll now go ahead and code that trainer app urls.py. Here I'll say from Django.urls. I want to import path. From .views, I want to import sign up. All right, so now let's go into some URL patterns here, where I have the path. The whole API/v1/trainers will be back in my projects. So here I'll just have to add sign up. And I'll go ahead and put my signup.as view. Awesome. Let's go ahead and tie it in the projects portion. Not in settings. Let me actually start closing down a lot of this white noise that I have here that we're not going to need. Come down here. Perfect. Here I'm going to go ahead and add path API/v1/trainers. And this is going to include the trainer app.urls. All right. My project is still running. I can still run my GET request. Let's go ahead and change this to trainers/signup. Okay, well, I'm getting a detail. This method doesn't exist. Let's go ahead and try to run a post method to sign up without any parameters. If I take a look at the JSON body, I'm just going to empty it out. See what happens when I send this request. Okay, so my validators worked, and I'm getting back an error list. So I'm getting told, hey, my password, this field cannot be blank. I'm getting told a username, this field cannot be blank. I'm getting told email, this field cannot be blank. Okay, let's go ahead and run that here. Well, I have my password. Let's make my password of FR. I have my email. Let's make my email of fr@fr.com. Carlos, go ahead.
So what? I thought we had put the under required fields, the first name and the last name.
We have. Yes, we're not done. All right. Let me go ahead and send this over. So it looks like I got a token, and that is raising an issue here because I had to added into my models a required fields name of first name and last name. Well, why isn't this working? All right, if I added it into required fields, why isn't it actually requiring the existence of first name and last name? Well, let's take a look at our model. And actually, let's take a look at what first name and last name are. Well, first name and last name exist, but notice this blank.
Blank equals true.
Right? This blank equals true is what allowed us to actually be able to create our project or be able to create a trainer because we have blank equals true. If we wanted to change it, we can go ahead and make a migration and change that information. Let's see how much time we have. I'm going to leave this as a stretch goal. If we're able to finish within time, we'll go back and refactor this code to ensure that first name and last name are included. But we'll leave that for a stretch goal. Does that answer your question, Carlos?
It does.
All right, Andy?
So the model takes priority, essentially, right?
The model takes priority. What do you mean?
Yeah, I would assume if it's blank is true and then the required, you have it in a required, there was to be some sort of a conflict. But it doesn't tell you, it just keeps going. So what's in the model is, I guess, is what takes priority.
Got it. So to answer your question, yes, what's in the model would take priority. But just to clarify, there's still being an entry passed in for first name and last name, right? Because we have that in the required fields. So it's not like that entry isn't being passed in. It's just that that entry is being passed in as empty. Does that make sense, Andy?
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
Awesome. All right. So there's our model. Everything's working great. We're able to send a request, and now we have a token. I'm actually going to take this token and I'm going to save it. I'm just going to put it in my playground for now so that it's available for me later on when I need it. Great.
How long is that token good for?
So this token is actually good indefinitely unless I give it a method to kill it. So you have to implement that yourself. Um, Let me take a look here. I believe inside of Django REST frameworks, there's a way to implement that. Let me see, token authentication, user token. Yep, generating token, cool. Um, I can't remember it off the top of my head, but there is a way for you to assign a death parameter for that token. Worst comes to worst, you can also generate a method that would do that for you. All right. So there we have our token. Everything's great. I'm able to grab my user, but let's take a look at our database here and actually see the user. Let's run this select query. So select all from trainer, and let's see what's happening. And this might look better if I just bring it up here. All right. So the first thing that we see is the ID of one. The next thing is our password. Notice that even though my password was just FR, it's being hashed when entered into my database. Right? That's happening because of that create user method. Well, now I have a couple of issues here. I have last login, which is empty. Okay, that's a design decision if we want to call it that. We could have it to where, hey, a user can sign up, but they actually have to explicitly log in afterwards. Fine, we'll go ahead and leave it like that for now. We have the is super user, which is set to false. We have our username, which is set to fr@fr.com. First name, which is blank. Last name, which is blank. We have an is staff, which is false. Now, staff and super user are different types of permissions. So please don't get those confused. We're not going to dive into permissions today, but definitely something to look into if you're creating some sort of administration portal, um, like a student portal, for example. Maybe you want your teachers to be part of is staff, and then you want your developers to be super users. There's a difference between the two. And we do have a date joined. Okay, great. And we have our likes Pokemon is equal to true. Everything's working pretty well. Well, now let's go into the login function. Let's say that I want to log in a user. So let's say class login. This is going to take in an API view. Now in this class, when I log in a user, again, we're going to respond with the token. So some of this information here might still be reusable. But let's see what happens as far as handling the authentication method, because we're no longer creating, right? We actually need to authenticate. So here I'm going to run def post because I'm logging in. It's going to take in a request. And in this case, data should be equal to request.data.copy. And what I'm expecting within data is simply just a username and password. That's all I need to be able to authenticate a user. I'm not creating a new user. I'm just authenticating an already existing user to grab their token. Okay. Well, now let's come down here and let's start actually grabbing this user. So let's say trainer is equal to, well, how do I authenticate it? I could do something like where trainer.objects.get, and then I could try to get where the username field is equal to data.username, and the password field is equal to data.password. But that's not necessarily going to work. The biggest reason why this wouldn't work is because my password field, well, it's hashed. So just passing in the password against it wouldn't actually create a match, right? This would always return none. Well, this isn't going to work. I could write a method that would hash the password and then try to find the correct hash for it, or write a method that would unhash the password from the database. But that all seems kind of troublesome to put on the developer. And the whole point of Django is to have these tools straight out of the box. Well, in this case, we do have these tools straight out of the box. What we have here is going to be the authenticate method. And the authenticate method will come from Django.contrib.auth, and it will import the authenticate method. So now instead of doing this whole, and actually what I'm going to do is I'll boom, boom, there you go. I'll go ahead and authenticate. And authenticate expects a couple of things here. Authenticate just expects you to pass in the username, which is equal to request, or excuse me, data.get. username. And then we have password, which is equal to data.get password. All right. So now we're able to grab a trainer. Or we hope that this will return a trainer instance that we can work with. Well, the authenticate function will either return an abstract user or none. It's telling me there are the two options that it will return. Well, let's see. If that's the case, well, I can say if trainer, because we know there's only two options. There will either be a trainer or it will return none. So if the trainer exists, I can grab the token and return a response. And otherwise, I can say else. We can return a response saying no user matching these credentials. And I can run this to a status of HTTP 404 not found because we didn't get a user. Well, now in this portion, if there is a trainer, well, I want to grab a token. But there's the issue that I have already created. There's a chance that I have already created a token for a user. So maybe there's a different method that I can use to grab my token or create a token in case the token has been deleted. Well, I do this by passing in token is equal to token.objects.get or create, where I can pass in the user as my trainer. Now, this get or create method is actually going to return a tuple. That tuple will have the token and a Boolean value stating whether it was created or not. Now, I don't necessarily care about that Boolean value. It's a nice to have, and if I want to run some logic on it, I can. But in this scenario, I really do not care. So I'm going to just deconstruct that tuple. That Boolean value will be set to that underscore. So this get or create will actually return the token object to the first value. And then it'll return that tuple, whether it was created or not, where created would be true and not created would be false, into that underscore. Well, now I have my token object, I have my trainer, and we know that in this login process, all I want to do is return a token. But there's a little bit more. Let's go into PSQL. We can see the last login portion. Well, that means I actually have to log in a user. And unfortunately, authenticating a user does not automatically log them in. Well, again, Django's batteries included, so they gave us a login method. And for that login method, all we need to do is pass in the request. And let me make sure that's the case. Okay, we'll take in the request and the user. I apologize, everyone. And I'm finding that here in the Django documentation. I apologize. I didn't realize I wasn't sharing this until now. So find that here in the Django documentation. I did a quick Google search for the login function. And then afterwards, I started scrolling through. Here we see how to see the logger function, the login in function. And we can see the login, request, and user there down below. All right. Let's actually implement that. by coming down to our view. And we can say login, which will take in the request and the user. Let's actually name this request equals request and user equals trainer. Just to make sure that there's no confusion in that. Okay, so now my request and user are being passed in. It is telling me that it has the default of none, so it might not even require the user, but I'm going to pass it in for now just so that it has it. All right. So now a user will be able to log in as well. And I can finally return my response. So I can say return response of token object dot key. And I can actually format this a little bit better. Oh. Let's go ahead and pass this into token to make sure there's some sort of consistency here from the one up above. And in this case, I'm not creating anything. So for my status, I'll just go ahead and pass in HTTP 200 OK. All right, let's make sure my server is still up and running. Great. Let's come back to some URLs and tie it all in. Gonna bring in my login. I'm gonna say path login. We'll go to the login API view as a view and end it with a comma. Well, currently I have email and password. I know I'm expecting username and password, so I'm just going to change that to username. And instead of going to sign up, I'll be sending this to login. Let's send this request and see what happens. So the request is processed and I get back the same exact token. If I send an invalid request, I get no user matches these credentials. All right, I go back to sending my request one more time, and there's my user, currently being logged in. Well, now let's check P-SQL. Let's run our query. And now for the last login portion, we can see that the user last logged in 2025-07/31 at this time in my application. All right, well, we talked about tokens and being able to reset them. You might want to write some logic, or in case you want to reset them, there might be some logic that says, hey, if the last login was so many days ago, or the last time the user was active was so many days ago, then I want to delete that token and just have them re-sign in. Right? Like Google has some implementation like that, and it drives me nuts because I have to re-sign into my stuff every like 2 weeks. All right. So that's going to be our login method and our login API view. Does anyone have any questions over how we implemented the ability for a user to log in? All right, let's hear it, Carlos.
So how you were saying earlier, it's like if once you create the user, you would typically want, or based on design, however you choose, you would want them to immediately be logged in. So would you basically make from the create user, would you make an API call to the post to log in? Or would you just pull some of this logic that you have in the post here and implement it after the create user?
That's a great question. And what you want to implement, which again is a design-based decision, if as soon as a user signs up, you want them to be logged in rather than having them be redirected to a login page, which I think is ideal, I would just take this line 39 and place it up here inside of your logic after line 25. Does that answer your question, Carlos?
Yes, sir, it does.
All right, Alex.
Could you explain again why it's a post here? Because would it make a new instance of a certain user logging in every time?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when it comes to user authentication, the CRUD concepts kind of go out the window. they don't necessarily apply in this case, right? Where we're actually creating something. I have heard the argument being made of, oh, well, you can possibly be creating a new token, but when it comes to actually handling user authentication, CRUD doesn't actually, the behavior doesn't attach to the method. But the standard for handling user authentication, logins would be of post and signups would be of post. Does that answer your question, Alex?
Yep. Thank you.
All right, Andy.
Could you explain the logic for the response where you're returning the token? Is it just for the debug purposes that you're showing it on the screen? Because normally, like, you wouldn't show the token, right? So I just want to figure out that piece out.
I think I'm confused. Where are we talking about? Can you come
Line 40, line 40, where you're returning a response with the token itself, with the key, token object dot key.
Mhm.
That's the is that the password for token, or I'm kind of confused about that.
Got it. Okay. So the token itself is actually going to be hashed. So it's not going to be the actual token value. If we take a look here, we see the key value, right? That is being represented there. But if we come down below, when a key is generated, that generated key is being hashed and encoded.
Yeah.
So it's safe for me to be able to send it within HTTP requests or responses because it's hashed. I'm not going to run into some sort of security issue from this,
Okay.
right?
But
It's
the front end does need that hashed token every time it sends requests to the server. That's like the thing that lets it get what it needs based on the user, right?
That's correct.
So I
Yeah,
can't access Andy's data. He can't access mine. It's going to check the token to make sure that I'm authorized.
that's right.
Okay.
Unless you have Andy's token somehow, then you could essentially be Andy.
Okay. All right. All right. Thank you.
Yeah, it's kind of how we'll go into some other practical examples here shortly. All right. So now we have our models, we have our views, we're able to sign up, we're able to log in. The
I
last
think
two.
Michael's got a question.
Oh, go ahead.
Thank you. Line 39 login. Did you import that function from somewhere?
I did. Yes, it's being imported from Django.contrib.auth.
Awesome. Thank you.
Of course. All right. I apologize. I missed it, Michael. Well, now that I have sign up and log in, the only two methods that need to be applied are going to be of being able to grab my user's info and of being able to log out from a user. Now, in order to be able to do this, we're going to actually authenticate the user before running any of the logic within the API view. We're going to dive into how to do that. Now, I have been going for about an hour. Currently, it is 11:01. Let's go ahead and take a 15-minute break and come back at 11:15 to continue on with the lecture. Thank you so much, everyone, and I'll see everyone back here shortly. All right, welcome back, everyone. We just finished the sign up and the login portion. Now let's go ahead and grab some information regarding our user. All right, here I'm going to make a new API view. Here, this one I'm going to go ahead and name it info. I'm going to be grabbing, might want to actually turn this into a class, huh? Let's fix that. Here we have our class of info, which will inherit from the API view. And it will hold a get method. Now, this get method will receive a request. And here I'm going to go ahead and print request.user, just so we can visualize it for a second. Now it will return a response of true. All right. Now let's actually tie in this API view. I'll go into my URLs, bring in info, and I'll say path will include the info.asView and pass it on below. Well, let's go ahead and send this information. I come over to my request here inside of Postman, and I'm going to send a GET request. Okay, so I get back true. Fantastic. And if I take a look at the user, I'm seeing anonymous user. Well, currently I have a token, but I'm not attaching that token anywhere. Let's take a look at how we can apply these concepts of token authentication. One API view accepts a couple of parameters here. And let me take a look here. Okay, so API view will also find something called authentication classes. And if we take a look here, it's going to look at the settings of default authentication classes. Okay, that's good to know. We went into our settings.py and we added the token authentication inside of these authentication classes. So that's good. And then we have these permission classes, which again, this is going to be looking for some default already pre-built permission classes. Well, we can actually assign these class level attributes to authentication classes, to a list for the different authentications that we want to permit. And we can pass in our permission classes to a list of the different authentication methods we want to permit. Well, what would these authentication methods be? Let's take a look at the REST framework documentation. All right, so here in REST framework, I'm getting a bit of an example of how to apply my token authentication. Let me scroll up a little bit here and we'll see one below. Actually, it's being towards the top. So here's how authentication is determined. Here's an example view. So here we can see our authentication classes, and it takes in a list where in this case, it's utilizing either session or basic authentication. And both of these are coming from REST framework authentication import. Well, let's take a look here. I'm going to go ahead and import them. So I'll say from REST framework dot authentication import, oh man, token authentication. And I'll go ahead and say from REST framework dot permissions, I want to import is authenticated. You'll see that there are other permissions like is admin. There's something like is super user as well. But is super user doesn't come in from REST framework. It comes in from Django itself inside of its permission mixins. But currently what we're going to implement here are these two. Token authentication and is authenticated. So I can come down below and I can place token authentication and is authenticated. All of my mixins have been applied. Well, let's send a request one more time. I send a GET request here. Now I'm getting, hey, authentication credentials were not provided. Okay, great. How does it know that? How is it able to determine that authentication credentials weren't provided? Let me take a look at token authentication here and see what this does. Well, token authentication, it's a simple token-based authentication. So clients should authenticate by passing the token key in the authorization HTTP header, dependent or prepended with the string of token. For example, authorization should be token. The keyword that it's looking for is of token. Here we can see how it's able to grab the model in the authenticate method inside of it. It's going to go inside of the headers of the request. It's going to split that key. And once we have our key, it's going to decode it. Then it passes it to authenticate credentials, where authenticate credentials would receive that key, grab the token matching said key, and from there, it's going to return the user. So that's the process there. It's going to look into my headers. I'm going to go ahead and leave this out as some code there. So token authentication looks into headers for authorization. Header and expects the token to be prepended by the keyword token. And I should specify that what it expects is not the token, but the token key. All right. It then pulls the token from the database and matches it to a user through its one-to-one relationship. Finally, it returns the user within the request.user key. All right. So that gives me this whole portion of being able to grab a user, but it tells me, hey, permissions is authenticated. Well, what does is authenticated do? So is authenticated essentially just says, hey, is this a user? And does this user exist? That's all. One, it confirms that there's a user inside of the request. And two, it confirms that the user actually has been authenticated, meaning that it has the proper values passed in inside of it. Again, the authentication portion happens at the token authentication. And this is just a check, making sure, yes, that was successful. The user has been authenticated, and I have a good token for it. Well, let's go ahead and apply this information now. Currently, if I send my GET request, I get an invalid response. Well, let's change this from body to authorization. And actually, I'm going to go into headers, because this is where it's looking for it. And in headers, I'm going to add a new authorization key down below. Let me see if there's a way for me to change this layout here. Okay, likely not a way to change my layout. So let's take a look here. So there's my authorization. And the value that it's expecting will be of token followed by the actual token key. So I can come over to my playground, grab my token key here, copy it, and add it to Bright. So now my headers have been updated. Have a token key that's being sent here. Let's send a request. Well, now it's being processed and I'm getting back true. And if I go to my print statement down below in my server, which is printing the request.user, I'm seeing the username representation of the user. So now I can grab the user object and return some data. All right. So let's go ahead and return something along the lines of, hey, this is going to be the username, which will be request.user.email. We have the email, which is of request.user.email. We know they have their first name if it's included. I'll just go ahead and pass it in, which will be request.user.firstname. Same thing for last name, which will be a request.user.lastname. And finally, I can pass in token as part of the request or as part of my response to say request.user.auth token.key. And that way I can return a successful response representing all of the information regarding my user. Well, if I send my request again, there's my user. We have my username, my email, first name, last name, and the token pertaining to my user. I can go ahead and add other things here, or I can even create a serializer for it to be able to read some data. I can say likes Pokemon and put this to request.user.likes Pokemon. Go back, send my request, and now likes Pokemon's added in my request. All right, I see a hand go up. Go ahead, Andy.
Yeah, I'm a little confused on the info, the class info. What's the purpose of it? Where would it be used?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for example, the main example that I can think of is social media, right? Let's say you want to go see the details that pertain to you, not necessarily your metadata, but the key values that you may find inside of, let's say, Facebook. All right, so you go on Facebook, you go and click your profile details, and the very top portion that's just saying, hey, this is your username, this is your actual name, this is the email, the school you attended, college you went to, whatever it is that you have in those details, that would be placed inside this info portion. All right. And if I wanted to update any of that information to include my password or email, I would also create a put method within this info view to be able to implement that behavior. Does that answer your question?
It does. And then the follow-up thing is, if we are authenticating and once it's authenticated, why is the response giving back information, but the information is taken out of the request? I'm kind of confused. I thought maybe that would come from the database.
Got it. Yeah, that's a great question. So the request is being passed in, but this request.user is what comes out from the database. Let me specify this. So request.user is the representation of the trainer model, right? So this token authentication sets a trainer. So it goes into .objects.get where auth token is equal to the key that's being passed in. So everything is coming in from our database. It's not coming in from the request. The request itself is a dictionary. So request is equal to a dictionary of multiple key value pairs. And by default, the user is of none or of anonymous user. But when we run this token authentication class, so df token authentication, and apparently I can't spell token. This accepts the request. And currently we do have an authorization header that holds the key. Right, so this DEF of token accepts the request. It grabs the key, the token key to be equal to request dot authorization, which is what we're seeing here. This is just a slimmed down representation. This isn't actually the code that's being processed in the background. Just want to make sure that that's specified. I'm just writing a simpler representation of it. From there, the user that is assigned is equal to token dot objects dot get, where the key is equal to token key dot user, because we know the token class has a user attribute. And then finally it says request dot user is equal to the user, which in this case, it's a trainer object. So then after our token authentication gets called, our request looks like this. Let me just grab that here. Where instead of anonymous user, we have a trainer instance. Does that clarify things for you, Andy?
I think, yeah, a little bit. I'm still just gonna have to read the curriculum a little more, I think.
All right. Awesome. Well, now we have our permission classes. We are able to apply this process of token authentication and be able to grab a user's information. The last method that we're going to implement will be of delete. Well, it's a class of logout. This will, again, take in self and request, or excuse me, this will take in API view. And this will actually have a post method. Where this post method will take in self and request. We're going to apply those authentication classes to be a token authentication. And we're going to apply those permission classes to be of is authenticated. Now for this post portion, I'm going to grab the user. So I'll say user is equal to request.user. I'll grab the token, which is equal to user.auth token. So now I have both of them available to me. And I can delete this token here. I can just say token dot delete and return a response saying the main thing that I've seen here, or the commonality that I've seen, is just a success equals true, meaning the token has been deleted. Now this API view works in itself, but just like we had to log in a user, we also have to log out a user to allow them to log in again later on. So inside of this post method, I'm going to actually log out. And you'll see that all it needs is the request. So log out my user from the server. I will also delete their token and send back a response of success is true. Now to tie in the whole enchilada, I'll go back to my URLs, go into path, log out. I need to import the logout function, or excuse me, the logout view. Great. My view is well. My URLs are up and ready to go. Let's run this GET request one more time to make sure everything works. And now, if I go to logout and I send my request, oh, this is GET not allowed. Okay, so send it to post. And now I get a success equals true. Well, what happens if I send this back to GET? I still have my token, but now I'm getting an invalid token because the token no longer exists. If I change this back to a post and instead of log out, go to login. Let me come back over to my parameters here. Or excuse me, my body. Okay, my body's still included. Now notice I'm no longer sending that authorization header. I'll include it so that we can see it. And then we'll see the issue that happens if that authorization header is still there. So when I send it to login, it's going to give me an invalid token was processed. Now, nowhere inside of my login view, if we take a look at it, am I calling those permission or authentication classes? API view has a built-in functionality where if there is a token being passed in, and that's happening because of settings.py, where I specified that the only way I would allow authentication to happen would be through token authentication. If I receive a token, my API view will reject it if I don't have a way to handle it. So I need to ensure I remove the token from the request. Then I can send my request. I get a brand new token for my user, which I can then copy and paste. I can then allow the token to be available. Change the method back to get back my information. Change it to post and go to logout. And I get back success is equal to true. And now if I go into my pSQL and I grab from my SQL query, we can see that the password is still there. The last time logged in is a little bit more recent than what it was before. Before it was 8:55, now it's 9:39. That's thanks to that logout and login functions that I'm applying. And I have my date joined. All right. Does anyone have any questions over how we applied the info and the logout methods? Doesn't look like there are any questions. Let's do a little bit of cleanup here. So currently I'm handling for this token authentication portion in two separate views. Well, what if I had a ridiculous amount of views that required authentication from a user? Well, I don't want to have to rewrite authentication classes and permission classes over and over again. So what OOP concept can I apply to ensure that this is used by other classes?
Dry.
Inheritance.
Yeah,
So you're gonna make a main class and then inherit it to the rest.
perfect. So I can make a class called user permissions needed, or I could just call it user permissions, which will be of an API view that holds this token authentication portion. And inside of info, I would just inherit user permission. Down below, instead of API view for logout, I would just inherit user permission. And everything will still work the same. If I go back into login and I send my request of post without the header, you'll see I get a brand new token being provided for me. I can include said token, authorize it, go over to get some information for my trainer. And there it is. And then I'm able to log out a trainer with that same token. All right. Any questions regarding user actions? Let's hear it, Andy.
For the token, I noticed it's deleted. Does the token represent a session?
Uh, in this case, we're not utilizing sessions, so you could think of the session as something adjacent to the token. If we're utilizing sessions, then it would be the session that's deleted. So they're similar in as far as like functionality, but they're not the same.
Okay. Could you explain then what the token represents here?
Well, the token is representing the user itself and the time that the user is interacting with the API. It's not representing a session. Um,
Why is the user being deleted then?
the user is not being deleted. The token's being deleted.
Is a good analogy an ID card?
I would think of it that way, right?
You got to show your ID every time, but
Every
this
time you
ID
want to
gets
come in.
recycled rapidly if you delete it and you have to get a new ID.
Okay,
Right.
that makes sense. Okay.
Awesome. All right. Thank you for the assist there, Nick. Appreciate it. So now we have our users permissions, but these are all just common users. And if I try to go into my admin portal, let's say I go to HTTP 127, and instead of API/fires, I go to admin. Well, if I try to go to the admin portal and try to sign in as frfr.com and FR, I'm going to get an error. So it tells me, please enter the correct email and password for a staff account. Currently, I'm not a staff. So how do I handle a user being able to have access to the administration portal? Now,
Super user.
yeah, I would actually have to create a super user. This create super user is going to look a lot similar to this sign-up method. And you can probably do a little bit of refactoring where you can check within the request to figure out what URL pattern came in to decide whether you'll utilize create user or create super user. Or you can create a completely separate view for it if you'd like to create something different. Right? So let's have something similar in this case. Let's take the sign up view. Oh, hello. And let's take it down below. So in this case, instead of sign up, let's go ahead and do master sign up. So this API view, it's going to follow the same exact logic. It's going to grab all of the email, it'll grab the trainer, it's going to run full clean. If it works, great. But instead of create user, really the only difference is it's going to run create super user with the data that's being passed in. Now, there may be a portion where you want to run separate logic in here. Maybe your super user has some other requirements that you would like to include to be within the data. So you could have something where you check the data dictionary that's coming in for specific key value pairs. And if a key isn't there, to raise an exception. In this case, we're going to keep it as simple as possible, where the only thing we're changing is the create super user method. And now, within my URLs, I can apply it by saying path of master, and then send this to the master sign up. Now, a couple of things to take into consideration here. I don't want everybody to be able to access this URL pattern. And I don't want it to be exposed in GitHub. So I could take it as far as saying, hey, I'm actually going to hide it as master URL be equal to master slash, and then come back to my URLs, import OS, and state an f string of os.environ.get master URL. And that would return the proper URL to be able to ping this API. Well, now let's go ahead and set a post request to sign up. I'm going to take off that authorization header, then come over to my body. We have our username. We're also going to need an email. I'm actually going to change this to FA. And I'm going to send my request. Well, now a new trainer was created. Let's go ahead and take a look at my database here. I'm going to select all from trainer app, trainer. Couple of key differences to notice. So IDs, pretty much the same. Our passwords, they're both hashed. Last login, well, currently I haven't logged in my super user, so that's good. And then we have is super user. So I'm getting false for both of them. Interesting. And is staff, I'm also getting false for both of them. Huh. I was not expecting that. Let me go ahead and ensure this is happening correctly. Interesting. What did I mess up here?
Was it because you went to the URL sign up instead of masters?
Oh, thank you. I would do it. Supposed to be master. So let me go ahead and change this again. Whoa. Did not know that did that. Okay, so post, it's going to masters. Okay, let's send this request. Now it worked. And let's make sure this is working properly here. Okay. So now we see our previously two users that were created. They weren't super users, they're regular users. So they're getting false for is super user. But the brand new user, which we created, which is AV, is true for a super user and is true for is staff. So now I can come over to the admin portal and pass in AV at av.com with AV. And please
I think your password was still FR.
Of course it was. There you go. And now I have the ability to manage all of my different administration sites, and I'm within the admin portal. So that's how to handle super users. Again, not necessarily something that I want to expose or to have public to everybody as far as how to be able to create a super user. So I'm just going to go ahead and do this os.environ and hide that URL pattern so people can't just access it free willy-nilly. All right. Any questions over how to handle super users? Carlos, send it.
So even though you're hiding the master URL or yeah, the master path, if they like, I mean, obviously in this case, it's pretty simple, you know, it's just master forward slash. If they just were to type that in, it's not going to prevent them from going in there, right? It's just going to hide it like if they're looking at the code.
Right. It's just hiding it. It's not preventing anybody from being able to access it. Anybody can access it, but we are just hiding it. All right. Let me take a look here. Something else to take into consideration in regards to this. So another thing to take into consideration here is if somebody were to send a sign up with .data or for inside of this data, you want to make sure that is staff. So data.is staff. is equal to false, and data is super is equal to false. Now, the reason behind these two, even though we're utilizing the create user parameter or the create user function, I apologize. If somebody were to pass true for these in the database, it would still populate as a true for the is super user. So we ourselves want to account for somebody sending a malignant request there. All right. Any questions regarding token-based authentication? Perfect. We covered quite a bit today. Let me do a quick summary and then we'll go ahead and close it right up. So in summary, we talked from the very start about the different types of authentication. We decided that we would utilize token-based authentication, dove into the abstract user model, where the model itself of abstract user has a couple of key value pairs and a lot of built-in stuff that we can utilize with inheritance. Inside of our trainer app, we changed our username to be the email field, and we added whether they like Pokemon or not. Then we ran into some migration issues. We fixed those migration issues within settings.py by adding the auth user model. That allowed us to make migrations. But then when we tried to migrate, we actually ran into a conflict in dependencies. So we had to drop our database and reconstruct our database to then migrate for the very first time to drop any dependencies within the administration site or the administration module. That dropped all the dependencies, migrated successfully, and allowed us to have our user. We then went into Django REST framework for token-based authentication. In settings, we added this REST framework for default authentication classes, where we established that the only authentication class we are going to be utilizing will be of token-based authentication. We came up above to our installed apps, and we installed the auth token. We migrated because the auth token app has a model within it. We then came over to our views, where we're able to apply said token. We brought our trainer and then dove straight into some behaviors for the user, where a user is able to sign up for our site by passing in the required the fields that we are looking for of email, first name, last name, password, or username. We ensure that the username field is actually of email in case it doesn't get passed in. We ensure everything fits our validation. And then we create an instance of the trainer utilizing the create user method so that our password is hashed. We then also create a token for the user. And in our response, we return the token. Our master signup looks exactly the same with the exception of the create super user. Inside of our login method, we're able to send a request where we authenticate the credentials of a user with their username and password. This authenticate method will either return a user or none. If there is a user, we want to either grab or create a token for a user, log them in, and return the token in the response. In the case there is not a user that is returned by the authenticate method, we would return a response specifying there are no users matching these credentials. In user permissions, we establish this class to be inherited by any class that requires token authentication and for is authenticated for the permission classes. My info view is able to return all of a user's information through the request, or excuse me, through the token that's being passed in, which then loads the user onto the request. And that's where we're able to do this request.user.email. And then finally, we log out by being able to utilize the logout function and delete the token for the user. Does anyone have any questions over anything that we've covered today in regards to authentication? Doesn't look like we have any questions, so I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording here.